Hello, welcome back to my channel. And today I'm ranking the films of the great anime director Hayao Miyazaki. Now, I was that kid at school who didn't like Disney. They used to have lots of shows on TV in the afternoons for kids, showing clips of old Disney films. I hated them. I didn't like The Jungle Book or Pinocchio or Snow White or Dumbo. They bored me. I'd got into Star Wars, I'd got into 2000 AD, I'd got into hardcore science fiction, also a bit of horror when I was a kid, and Disney was too soft for me. I didn't enjoy it. I loved Tom and Jerry, I loved Bugs Bunny and Speedy Gonzales and all those sort of 7 minute cartoons where people like Chuck Jones and Tex Avery. That was animation for me, or something like Scooby Doo on kids' TV. I didn't really enjoy animation films. I hated how soft they were, how intended for children they were. I like to think I was an adult when I was about 6. They were too nice and they had songs in them which irritated me. So I tended to avoid Disney like the plague. Later in life, as I got older, I never watched these animated films. People liked Toy Story and The Invincibles and all this sort of thing. I avoided them like the plague. Animation used to give me a headache, actually. I remember going to see Tim Burton's The Nightmare Before Christmas and actually coming out of the cinema reeling as if I was drunk. Like, ugh. It's something about watching animation on the screen didn't suit my eyes or something, and I hated it. Anyway, my opinion changed. And it changed thanks to this book, Film the Critic's Choice. This was a coffee table book that came out in the late 90s. And the editor, Jeff Andrew, he got 10 critics from around the world. And he gave them each an era of cinema. So the silent era, classic Hollywood, Nouvelle Vague, all this sort of thing. And asked them to pick the 15 best films of that era, the most remarkable films of that era. The last chapter he gave over to animation. It's unusual that a book like this gives so much, room to animation. Paul Wells is an animation expert, and he chose his films. And he chose the film Laputa, the Flying Island, a film that we now know better as Castle in the Sky. Amusingly, they didn't like the original title in English-speaking territories because La Puta means the whore in Spanish. So they changed it to Castle in the Sky, which I think is quite amusing. Of course, it's named after the flying island in Jonathan Swift's Gulliver's Travels. But reading this about this film, which I'd never heard of, I'd never seen it, he said that this was a masterpiece to put alongside Mizoguchi and Ozu, the great Japanese filmmakers. I thought, wow, that is a hell of a claim. An animation directed mostly at children, you're saying it's a masterpiece of all time. I've got to test this out. So I did. And I went and watched this film, Princess Mononoke. I got this out, I rented it out on DVD to check out whether this guy was telling porkies. And I was absolutely blown away. The sophistication and intelligence of the storytelling, the complexity of the characters, the beauty of the animation, how scary and also lyrical and charming and innocent it was at the same time. I was stunned. I'd got it wrong. Here was a major, major filmmaker. And so I started watching all of Miyazaki's films. And I found that he's become one of my absolute favourite directors, and I love his films. I still don't care for Disney much, or Toy Story, but I love Miyazaki. So in the rest of this video, I'm going to rank the 11 feature films he's made to date. Apparently, he's about to finish a new magnum opus. It could be coming out by the end of the year. But these are the 11 feature films he made to date. So at number 11, just outside my top 10, is The Castle of Cagliostro. This was his first feature and was part of the Lupin series, which had been a television and manga series. I don't know very much about the Lupin series. Some people have criticised this film for changing the character of the Lupin character, who was a bit more arrogant, a bit more dodgy in the original manga. I don't know much about it, so I'm not going to comment. I put this film at 11, not because it's a bad film, it's quite entertaining. It's a kind of caper film rescuing this princess from this evil baron type thing. It's just that it's not really a Miyazaki film. You can see traces of the later Miyazaki, but he hasn't matured. It doesn't have the feel of his later films, neither in the imagery or in its confidence in the storytelling. It's a good movie, but it could take its place alongside any other Japanese anime, really. It's worth a watch, but it's not that interesting. So let's get into the top 10. At number 10, now some Miyazaki fans are going to get cross with me for this, but I'm going to put Porco Rosso. They might get cross with me because in some ways this is the definitive Miyazaki film. It's the sort of, you know, how people talk about the roman à clef, the sort of key work that tells you about how a filmmaker or an artist thinks. This is that kind of film for Miyazaki. It's a very odd film where this Italian pilot of the 1930s transforms into a pig, and then he becomes a hero rescuing people in various daring aviation escapades. And it's an excuse for Miyazaki to indulge his fascination with aviation and planes. And there's all these kind of different weird flying machines, and this kind of acrobatic aviation ballet, and a huge kind of rescue thing right at the end of the movie. It's brilliantly done. It's very unusual. It's intriguing. I've just never fallen in love with it. That's why it's at number 10. It's an extraordinary film in some ways, but I just can't love this movie as much as I love some of the others. So apologies to big fans of Porco Rosso. At number 9 is The Wind Rises, and again, this is about Miyazaki's fascination with aviation. This was his last completed feature to date. Some people thought it was going to be his last film ever, and it did look like a sort of testament film. It's a film about Jiro Horikoshi, who was the man who designed the Japanese fighter planes for World War II, a controversial figure. And Miyazaki got some complaints that he'd made a film about this person and didn't put enough negative in the film about him. There is a little bit of discussion about him worried about what his beautiful machines are being used for, but not very much. But actually, I quite admire Miyazaki's take on this story. What he's interested in is a man who pursues his talent and his dreams to their nth degree. What he's interested in is Hirokoshi's interest in aviation and how he goes, he follows that through to an extreme, creating these brilliant planes. That's what Miyazaki is interested in. The fact that these planes were then used for awful warfare is touched upon in the film subtly and, but doesn't make up the whole film. And I respect that choice of Miyazaki. I don't think that means that Miyazaki doesn't care. I think he's interested in something else. The film is also quite an interesting a very light sort of ride through early 20th century Japanese history, the 1920 earthquake and so on. It's a very compelling and very moving story. It's very different from Miyazaki's other work because there's no fantasy elements, people turning into pigs and slime monsters and everything. So perhaps it doesn't have so much interest. But it's well worth seeing. If you've not caught it, it's well worth watching. And it does give you a clue to Miyazaki's way of thinking. Okay, let's get into the fun fantasy ones. At number 8 is Ponyo. This came out in the 2000s and was kind of overlooked, I think. It saw Miyazaki returning to the world of children's movies that he'd previously done in the late 80s with My Neighbor Totoro and Kiki's Delivery Service. And it's about this young boy, and he comes into contact with a goldfish princess who wants to be human, a bit like, The Little Mermaid or something like that. It's a very, very sweet film. Miyazaki starts it off with this sort of, big shot of all these fish swimming around, loads and loads of fish. It's a real sort of show-off beginning to the film, this grand gesture. But then it settles down into a quiet little tale, a little romance between a boy and a girl. I think it's very sweet. It's easy to overlook, but it's very hard to dismiss. It's just so much fun. It's so charming. So in 7th place then is My Neighbor Totoro, the ultimate children's film and many people's favourite Miyazaki film. I love this film as much as anyone else. It's such a moving film, two children moving to the countryside while their mother is ill, and they meet these kind of spirits in the neighbouring wood. And there's that famous scene, of course, when she's waiting for the bus and that great big cat monster or something is standing beside her, and then the cat bus comes. I mean, that whole sequence is so beautiful. It's so charming. One of the great scenes in children's film history. It's a movie that's laced with sadness. I have to confess, when I first saw it, I was one of those people, this is a whole debate online, that thought the mother died at the end. She doesn't. Don't worry, she doesn't. I got it wrong. But a lot of people think that actually that's what the movie is about. In fact, it was based on a childhood experience for Miyazaki himself. His mother had some spinal problem when he was a kid, and she was away at the hospital much of the time, and that's what it's based on. But don't worry if this makes it sound very dark. It's an extremely charming film. I think anyone could watch this, young or old, child or adult, and be absolutely moved by it and taken up by it. It's a wonderful fantasy. But you know what? My personal favourite of the children's Miyazaki films is Kiki's Delivery Service, which came next. I think this is a very, very underrated movie. It's about a young witch. She moves to another town, and it's about her taking up a job. She starts delivering for a bakery, and it's just about a young girl becoming an adult, really. She has disappointments. She falls out with her cat. Sometimes the job goes wrong, but then she saves her friend, a young boy, and she regains her confidence. And it's just a sort of rites of passage story, but it's very charming. It also has the single best cat in movies. The cat that she has is wonderful. I love the little animation it has when it goes along to its bowl and tries to lick the food and it's too hot. And it goes. I think that's a very charming scene. I think this is a beautiful little film, very touching, very simple, very innocent, but all the drama is there if you care to look. And I think it's a great film for the whole family. Next is Princess Mononoke, the film that introduced me to Miyazaki. I think this is an extraordinary film, a more adult film perhaps. Some of the characterization, particularly of the monk that befriends the main boy, is quite complex. And some of the imagery is quite startling. Like the film begins with this kind of wild boar, this kind of diseased wild boar rampaging through the countryside. Horrific. Amazing imagery, stunning film, very complex. I think this is a film that anyone could sit down and enjoy again. Absolutely brilliant film. If you've never seen a Miyazaki film, I think this is a very good place to start, actually. All his imagery and all his ideas are present and correct, and are developed at their most beautiful. It's a really stunning piece of work. Fourth place, this is another of the films that most Miyazaki fans put top, is Spirited Away. This is a masterpiece. It absolutely deserves every bit of its reputation. It's about a little girl, once again a little girl who has to fight. She has to get work and survive outside of her parents, who also get turned into pigs. There's an obsession with being turned into pigs, isn't there? And she gets to work at this sort of bathhouse. And there's a wonderful scene where she has to give a bath to this, I think it's a spirit of a polluted river, this kind of great big green slimy thing that it descends into this sort of Japanese bath and the water, pours over. It's a great scene. And that sort of preempts the end of the film, this incredible scene where the whole landscape seems to get flooded. And you see this tram going through a flooded landscape. Incredible imagery. Some of it startling and frightening, some of it beautiful, some of it cute. This is a real children's masterpiece. I've put it fourth simply because there's three other films I like, but I have nothing bad to say about it at all. It's absolutely fantastic. In third place, then, is Laputa, the Flying Island, otherwise now known as Castle in the Sky. By the way, I should say that you really should watch these films in the original Japanese with subtitles. I know people are lazy and want to listen to the American actors doing the voiceover, but I think these films really lose something if you don't have the original Japanese. There we go. I've said it. I'll shut up now. Anyway, this is a lovely film about two kids on the run from air pirates and bandits of various descriptions, protecting this crystal, trying to find this mythical flying island. And they find it, and the sequences on the island are absolutely, they're special and beautiful. If you like this film, track down a French animation called The King and the Mockingbird, which was made by Paul Grimaud. It was originally started filming in 1948. It was never finished at the time, and the producer took it away from the director and released it unfinished. Paul Grimaud fought for about 30 years to complete the film and finally completed it in 1980. Now, it's very much a sort of fairy tale film in the European tradition, but it has extraordinary animation. And the reason you should watch it is because it was a huge influence on this film. And you'll see that in the robot at the end of The King and the Mockingbird is very similar to the robot in Castle in the Sky. You can see that Miyazaki was almost paying homage in a way. And both are very sad characters, the two robots. This is a beautiful film. This was the film that Paul Wells spoke about in that book, and I found that it was a masterpiece, and that he was right to praise it so highly. It's great. But we've still got two more films to go. Before Castle in the Sky is Nausicaä of the Valley of the Wind. This is an extremely underrated film, and I would go so far as to say I think it's one of the best science fiction films ever made. I know, quite a claim. It's set in a post-apocalyptic future where the land has been diseased, and there's this kind of diseased jungle full of these kind of weird insect beasts called the Ohm. And there's a young princess, and she gets involved in... There's a sort of rivalry between these two kingdoms. And during the rivalry, she finds herself... She crash lands in this jungle, this diseased jungle. But she finds that she falls through into a lower world, which has become purified. And the imagery is incredibly beautiful. And there are images in this film that will stay with you, like when the Ohm go on the rampage, they turn from blue into red eyes, and they stampede like cattle. It's an extraordinary image. There's another beautiful image where there's this beast from the irradiated jungle, and it's playing with her like a cat, and it bites her, and you see this little bit of blood come out of her finger. It's a moment where you think, oh my God, has she been poisoned? But it's also very beautiful and tender. And that sort of sums up Miyazaki in the way he works as a filmmaker. This is an incredibly atmospheric film. It stays with you afterwards. I think it's underrated because it's an early part of Miyazaki's work. But I think as a work of science fiction, it's absolutely superb. And definitely track it down. But my number one place goes to Howl's Moving Castle, based on the books of Diana Wynne-Jones, a Welsh writer. This is such a lovely film. It's about a young girl, and at the start of the film, she's turned into an old witch. She's turned by a witch into an old woman. And basically, she spends most of the film as an old woman. I like that a children's film has an old person as a main character all the way through the film. She falls in love with a wizard who lives in this wonderful moving castle, this kind of bit of steampunk that clambers across the countryside. An absolutely brilliant invention by Miyazaki. And it's powered by this little fire demon. He's like this little flame with two little eyes called Calcifer. And it's very charming. And they get involved again in a war between two kingdoms. And the imagery, the constant imagery and symbolism of change and transformation throughout this film is extraordinary. And sometimes you see the girl, when she's becoming more confident, going back to being a young girl and then going back to being an old woman. And this kind of idea of transformation goes throughout the whole film. There's one extraordinary sequence, I can't remember exactly where it occurs in the film, where she confronts Lady Suleiman, who's the evil sort of villainess of the film. And then suddenly she appears to be backing away from her, and an ocean grows between them. It's an extraordinary scene. And that kind of imagery permeates the entire film. The characters are cute, wonderful, and great fun. It's also expansive and epic. It's also intimate, playful, and charming. And I absolutely love this film. Even if you're not a great animation fan, even if you're not a romantic, I think you'll like it. I think you'll find something in it to enjoy. And the animation is always very beautiful. So that's my ranking of the Miyazaki films. Please let me know your rankings below, what you think of the films that I've put near the bottom. What do you think of Porco Rosso? Have I underrated it? I probably have, haven't I? Well, let me know what your list is, and if you like my content, please like and subscribe.